This is not about politics, this is about
obscene injustice.
Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, and this is a freshly washed, very white Winnie the Westie, and this story is an egregious injustice, and it's not about politics, it's not about the political players involved, it's just about the abuse of the judicial system.
To make a point.
For those of you who may not know, the man that has been dubbed the QAnon Shaman, the guy who stormed the Capitol building on January 6, dressed like a wolf or something, carrying a flag on a spear, howling at the ceiling, well, he was sentenced to jail, and he was sentenced to 41 months in prison. QAnon Shaman Jacob Chansley sentenced to 41 months in prison for role in U.S. Capitol riots. Now, there are going to be people out there who are going to accuse me of playing politics, only focusing on this story because of the political angle to it. They're going to accuse me of being partisan, to which I might say, hashtag confession through projection, I have objected to injustices whenever I see them, regardless of the politics behind it. There was that story of Willie Nash, a man who was sentenced to 12 years in jail for having a cell phone in prison. I heard that story. I could not believe such an injustice could ever occur. I did a vlog breaking that down. I discussed the issues of injustice when I see them, and right here, I see an outright injustice. This story is being passed off as the first of the felony convictions in the January 6th insurrection, which the FBI found there was no coordinated effort for. The media portrays this as egregious, felonious behavior in order to somewhat justify the 41 months prison sentence. But when you know what the QAnon Shaman actually was accused of having done on that day, the sentence becomes even more
over the top.
From the website of the United States Department of Justice.
You serious?
Chansley Jacob Anthony, a.k.a. Jacob Angeli. Charges: civil disorder, obstruction of an official proceeding, entering and remaining in a restricted building, disorderly and disruptive conduct in a restricted building, violent entry and disorderly conduct in a Capitol building, parading, demonstrating, or picketing in a Capitol building. We are going to get into the actual acts that Chansley is alleged to have committed that the Department of Justice said they would have been able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, but just bear in mind, those are the charges, and also bear in mind that Chansley was kept in jail for months and at some points in solitary confinement. He was held in jail for months, sometimes in solitary confinement. The full wrath of the legal system was brought down on his head to the point where he finally agreed to a plea deal. United States versus Jacob Chansley. Dear Mr. Watkins, this letter sets forth the full and complete plea offer to your client, Jacob Chansley, herein referred to as your client or defendant, from the Office of the United States Attorney for the District of Columbia, herein also referred to as the government or this office. This plea offer expires on August 13, 2021. If your client accepts the terms and conditions of this offer, please have your client execute this document in the space provided below. Upon receipt of the executed document, this letter will become the plea agreement, hereinafter referred to as this agreement. The terms of the offer are as follows. Charges and statutory penalties. Your client agrees to plead guilty to count 2 in the indictment, charging your client with obstruction of an official proceeding in violation of 18 U.S.C. 1512 C2. And at the end of this agreement, you have Chansley's signature indicating seemingly that he agreed to this agreement, because after all, the charge that was brought against him carried a maximum sentence of 20 years, so he was probably better off agreeing to a reduced sentence instead of taking his chance before this Department of Justice. And yes, I know that he would have had a trial that would not have been in front of the Department of Justice. It would have been in front of the independent judiciary, and the Department of Justice would have only been the one bringing the charges. But call me black-pilled, call me somewhat cynical, something tells me that all of these forces tend to work in tandem. An overly zealous Department of Justice coming down with the full force of the law to make an example of Chansley, and I presume the courts would have pretty much done the same. Defendant's acceptance. I have read every page of this agreement and have discussed it with my attorney, Albert Watkins. I fully understand this agreement and agree to it without reservation. I do this voluntarily and of my own free will, intending to be legally bound. No threats have been made to me, nor am I under the influence of anything that could impede my ability to understand this agreement fully. Yeah, no threats, except for what some might feel to be exaggerated, egregiously trumped up charges that carry potential decades behind jail. No threats, just legal threats. And then to fully paper their file to make hard evidence that Chansley is willfully agreeing to this plea agreement, the government submits the following document, which is the statement of offense in support of the guilty plea. Defendant Jacob Chansley agrees to admit guilt and enter a plea of guilty to count 2 of the indictment, obstruction of an official proceeding in violation of 18 U.S.C. section 1512c2. The penalty for this offense is A. a term of imprisonment not greater than 20 years, B. a fine not to exceed $1 million, C. a term of supervised release up to 3 years after any period of incarceration, and D. a special assessment of $100. The government then goes on to set out the facts that they argue they would have been able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt at a trial, and just wait until you hear these facts to possibly justify in the minds and hearts of the general public what could possibly justify a prison sentence of 41 months. Statement of facts. The government respectfully submits the following statement of offense in support of a plea of guilty by defendant Jacob Chansley to count 2 of the indictment in the above captioned matter. If this case were to go to trial, the government would prove the following facts beyond a reasonable doubt. By 1:50 p.m., the defendant Jacob Chansley was among the members of the crowd at the police line on the west front of the U.S. Capitol building, where U.S. Capitol Police and Metropolitan Police were standing in a line behind temporary, quote, bike rack, end quote, style barricades in order to keep back the crowd. The defendant was dressed in a Viking hat with fur and horns, was shirtless, wearing red, white, and blue face paint, and carrying an American flag tied to a pole with a sharp object at the tip and a bullhorn. The defendant climbed the media tower erected for the inauguration directly ahead of the police line, holding the rioters back at the west front. And this is where it gets interesting. Just pay attention to the wording, because what the government is alleging here is that they would have been able to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt, but what they are alleging that they would have been able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt are not acts that Chansley himself is alleged to have committed. At approximately 2 p.m., certain individuals in the crowd forced their way through, up, and over the barricades and officers of the U.S. Capitol Police, and the crowd advanced to the exterior facade of the building. The crowd was not lawfully authorized to enter or remain in the building, and prior to entering the building, no members of the crowd submitted to security screenings or weapons checks by U.S. Capitol Police officers or other authorized security officials. They are talking about alleged acts of wrongdoing committed by the crowd, and although Chansley was among the crowd, just notice at the absence of any specificity of any specific act that Chansley committed that could possibly justify 41 months in prison. The defendant was among the crowd that passed the police line at the west front, entered the scaffolding erected in advance of the inauguration on top of the staircase heading up to the lower west terrace of the U.S. Capitol building. The defendant and others pushed past the police line at the top of the scaffolding and entered the upper west terrace of the U.S. Capitol building at approximately 2:10 p.m. At such time, the certification proceedings were still underway and the exterior doors and windows of the U.S. Capitol were locked or otherwise secured. Members of the U.S. Capitol Police attempted to maintain order and keep the crowd from entering the Capitol. However, shortly after 2 p.m., individuals in the crowd forced entry into the U.S. Capitol, including by breaking windows and by assaulting members of law enforcement, as others in the crowd encouraged and assisted those acts. Individuals in the crowd forced entry and assaulted officers, and other individuals encouraged it without any specific allegation that Chansley himself ever committed any act of violence. The defendant was with the mob that approached the first floor of the U.S. Capitol building on the Senate side. Other members of the crowd broke 2 windows and crawled inside the building at approximately 2:13 p.m. Those rioters then broke open the door to the U.S. Capitol building between the 2 broken windows, setting off a loud alarm. The defendant then entered through the broken door at approximately 2:14 p.m. The defendant was one of the first 30 rioters inside the U.S. Capitol building. This is what the government is alleging they would have been able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, and even giving them the benefit of the doubt, there is not one act of violence that Chansley is alleged to have committed himself. This prosecution is not about justice. It is not about going after the actual wrongdoers. It is about making an example of Chansley and setting the new standard for everyone else who is awaiting sentencing in these events. Instead of obeying the instructions of the U.S. Capitol Police to leave the building, the defendant traversed another staircase to the 3rd floor of the Senate side of the U.S. Capitol building. At approximately 2:52 p.m., the defendant entered the gallery of the Senate alone. The defendant then proceeded to scream obscenities in the gallery, while other rioters flooded the chamber below. The defendant then left the gallery and proceeded down a staircase in an attempt to gain entry to the Senate floor. There, the defendant once again encountered Officer K.R., who once again asked him to leave the building. The defendant insisted that others were already on the Senate floor and he was going to join them. Officer K.R. then followed the defendant on the Senate floor. The officer then allegedly asked Chansley to leave again, and Chansley refused, referring to Mike Pence as an effing traitor, saying justice is coming, yada yada yada, and then he took his bullhorn to make some more messages known to the public. After Officer K.R. again asked the defendant to vacate the seat, the defendant remained, calling other rioters up to the dais and leading them in an incantation over his bullhorn, which included giving thanks for the opportunity, quote, to allow us to send a message to all tyrants, the communists and the globalists, that this is our nation, not theirs, that we will not allow America, the American way of the United States of America, to go down, end quote. The defendant went on to say, quote, thank you for allowing the United States of America to be reborn. Thank you for allowing us to get rid of the communists, the globalists, and the traitors within our government, end quote. The government then alleges that in light of the circumstances, the congressional proceedings had to be suspended and could not resume until every one of the unauthorized entrants had been evacuated from the building, and that the congressional proceedings did in fact resume towards 8 p.m. that evening. But again, it is not alleged anywhere that Chansley actually committed any specific act of violence, and that is not to condone what he did. It is just to highlight the fact that being sentenced to 41 months in prison for what the government says it could have proved beyond a reasonable doubt had he gone to trial is absolutely absurd and over the top. But again, based on the circumstances, reading how the media is spinning this, reading the words of the judge, the exchange between the judge and Chansley, it is quite clear that this was never about justice. This was about setting the standard for future sentences to punish the other people involved in the January 6th events. From the CNN article, Judge Royce Lamberth has had Chansley held in jail since his arrest, despite his multiple attempts to gain sympathy and his release. Other judges are likely to look at Lamberth's sentence as a possible benchmark, since Chansley is one of the first felony defendants among the more than 660 Capitol riot cases to receive a punishment. Later on in the article, quote, "He made himself the image of the riot, didn't he?" end quote, Lamberth said to Chansley's defense attorney. Quote, "For good or bad, he made himself the very image of this whole event," end quote. Alright, be that as it may, I think we could concede that, although some might argue that it was the media that made him the image of the event and not necessarily him himself. But what does that change in terms of the sentencing? He might have been the image of the event, but what is accused of him could not possibly justify 41 months in prison, and he has been detained since his arrest. And the part that I personally find most disgusting about all of this is that Chansley, seemingly still thinking that the system is operating in good faith, basically throws himself at the mercy of the court. Chansley throwing himself at the mercy of the court and apologizing for everything was never going to operate for his benefit. It was only going to justify the sanction the judge wanted to impose. Quote, "The hardest part about this is to know that I'm to blame. To have to look in the mirror and know you really messed up royally," end quote, Chansley said. Quote, "I was in solitary confinement because of me, because of my decision. I broke the law. I should do what Gandhi would do and take responsibility," end quote, he says. Quote, "There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's what men of honor do," end quote. He promised to never have to be in jail again. Oh, you thought the court was going to accept your apology and show you mercy, Chansley? Well, I think now you've learned a lesson, and I think pretty much everyone watching this situation has also learned a lesson. Because just listen to what the judge says in response. Quote, "I think your remarks are the most remarkable I've heard in 34 years," end quote, Lamberth told Chansley, calling his speech, quote, "akin to the kind of thing Martin Luther King would have said," end quote. But Lamberth added, quote, "What you did here was as horrific as you now concede," end quote, and he could not justify a shorter sentence. What did you learn, Chansley? Apologies to the court were never intended to help you, they were only intended to hurt you. After the hearing, Chansley's attorney Albert Watkins said that Chansley is, quote, "embracing being held accountable," end quote. Chansley will get credit for the time he has already served behind bars. He will also have to pay $2,000 for damage done to the Capitol building during the riot, and will serve 3 years of a supervised release at the end of his prison term. This story has been updated. It's always nice for CNN to indicate that the story has been updated without indicating what part of the story has been updated, but regardless, that is the story. It is an absolute injustice. It may not be as much of an injustice as Willie Nash being sentenced to 12 years in jail for having a cell phone in jail, but this is an injustice, and anyone who doesn't think it's an injustice is playing politics. I can easily see this ending in some jail time, although much less than the 41 months he was sentenced to serve, and I do not for the life of me understand how anything in this story could have possibly justified the continued detention of Chansley since his arrest. Even by the government's own documents, he was not accused of having done anything specifically violent that could possibly warrant his continued detention. This has been an injustice from day one to the present date, and it is only being exploited
for political purposes.
Alright, and I have again worked myself into a sweat, so I'm going to pet the dog who seems to be losing some hair. I better brush him down after this. But if you like my videos, you like my content, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, drop a comment in the comment section below, because it feeds the algorithm. If you want to support the channel, all of the support links are in the pinned comment. Robert Barnes and I do weekly live streams every Sunday. We're going to discuss this during our next live stream. We do weekly streams with a guest every Wednesday called The Sidebar. If you want to find us and support us on Locals, where supporters get lots of exclusive content, you can find us at...
Oh, man, one of these days I'll get this right. There we go. Viva BarnesLaw.locals.com.
All of my content is also on Rumble, so you can catch it there. But more important than anything, take care of yourselves, check in on friends and family, make sure everyone around you is doing well, and now you know your vlog. Peace out.